Anorexia nervosa remains an elephant in the room topic.
When you say I felt guilty because I chose to do something, well, yeah, but probably 9 out of 10 girls between age of 11 and 16 or 17 choose to diet, but they don't get anorexia.
Wow. That changes a lot.
And it is unequivocal at this point that eating disorders do run in families and they're heritable. And heritable means that between 48 and up to 62% of liability to these illnesses are due to genetic factors.
In the last video, the question of how anorexia progresses was answered by looking at its biological progression from advancements in brain imaging technology, neuroendocrinology, animal studies, and the human starvation study. In this video, we will answer the question of why anorexia happens in the first place. So let's compare this by asking a similar question of why do birds migrate? Their travel path, their distance of travel, and duration of travel tell us how they travel, but it leaves out the question of why they travel in the first place. The migration stems from the bird's genetics, a survival mechanism to find food. In evolutionary terms, only a short time has passed since humans no longer need to worry about finding food. Genes that allowed our ancestors to survive were passed on and still affect our lives. The first part of the video retraces the evolutionary history of humans and focuses on the successful migration of our hunter-gatherer ancestors when faced with periodic famine. Today's anorexics are simply descendants of hunter-gatherer scouts who unknowingly triggered the adaptive response of anorexia that cues the body into migratory mode. The second part of the video elaborates on how this survival mechanism, lasting longer than originally intended, becomes what we observe as anorexia in modern days. Today, it is hard for us to imagine famine because food is abundant. However, for a person born with genetic predisposition, losing weight is famine to the body. This perceived famine involuntarily triggers our ancestors' adapted to flee famine response. This mechanism is an adaptive response that can explain why anorexia happens. The third part of the video chronicles the various explanations to puzzling yet homogeneous symptoms of anorexia throughout history. Anorexia's misinterpretations are highlighted based on categorical explanations that miss the big picture and continue to harbor stigma. Anorexia is triggered by weight loss, not by psychological issues. By acknowledging that psychological issues do not cause anorexia, a paradigm shift can begin. The last part of the video shows how advances in brain studies prove that people are born with genetic predisposition to anorexia, and only these select individuals can trigger the biological progression of anorexia. In evolutionary terms, only a short time has passed since humans no longer need to worry about finding food. Genes that allowed our ancestors to survive were passed on and still affect our lives. Instead of the body's need to feed itself, an adaptive mechanism is activated that has helped our ancestors migrate to survive famine long ago. This mechanism is misunderstood today and thus has become a liability. It is difficult for us to imagine experiencing famine and having to migrate to search for food for survival. But this was everyday life for our hunter-gatherer ancestors prior to agriculture, which has only existed the last 12,000 years out of the 200,000 years we've existed as Homo sapiens.
Absence of agriculture and in the absence of permanent dwellings, which is much like the lives that our ancestors lived over 95% of human evolutionary history.
One of the first things you must know about hunter-gatherers is they move, they migrate, and they move a lot.
For 95% of our human evolutionary history, we evolved as hunter-gatherers who had to travel far to escape famine. Scouts were sent to search for the food, and those who could travel energetically with hardly any food were the survivors.
Those individuals in the band who were already naturally high in self-control, not particularly food motivated.
They could be sent as advanced scouts. They sent their teenage girls.
Traits of scouts fit all the symptoms of anorexics today. This adapted mechanism to switch on migrating mode is encoded in human genes and affects our lives still today. Today, it is hard for us to imagine famine because food is abundant. However, for a person born with genetic predisposition, losing weight is famine to the body. Basically, when you lose weight, you're signaling to your body that food is scarce. So don't be fooled. Even when there's food on the table, your body still experiences famine when you lose weight. This perceived famine involuntarily triggers our ancestors' adapted to flee famine response.
The adapted to flee famine hypothesis was consistent with more of what is known about anorexia than any of the other theories. Explained why starving people would be afraid of eating, why they would be hyperactive, why they would look at thin bodies and see fat, because that would give them confidence to travel.
Relatively homogeneous disorder occurs mostly in girls, onset, adolescence, around puberty, develop severe restricted eating, most of them relentlessly over-exercise. And of course, they have body image distortion.
The trait makes sense of all the symptoms. Why these three things, resisting eating, hyperactivity, body fat exaggeration, and super adaptive at one time.
Symptoms of anorexia are food restriction, hyperactivity, and denial of starvation. These symptoms have remained consistent throughout history. However, experts and sufferers have given alternate meanings and interpretations to something that is fundamentally biological.
There are many, many, many theories that want to lose weight that have changed depending on what they think women are preoccupied about. It's always been there from the earliest descriptions.
Far back as saints in the 1400s and things like that, where there are descriptions of women who were foregoing food to the point of death.
It was first described in the 1880s. The doctors thought it was hysteria. Freud signed on to that one, and maybe hysterical fear of sex. Later, they thought it was a fear of being a grown-up. A psychiatrist named Hildebrand. Look, these are victims. These are victims of a controlling mother. If you have a child starving to death, you get pretty controlling. So before the 1960s, people rarely fear of getting fat or not wanting to get fat as the reason for not eating.
For all that we hear about it and think about it in the current cultural context, and we hear so much about the thin ideal and the ways that that cultural pressures are impacting.
The ideal weight is actually an anorexic level of thinness. Not that all models are anorexic, but that if many people lost as much weight as, or had the BMI of models, they would develop anorexia if they have those genes.
Biological symptoms of all types have been given different interpretations throughout history. It depends on the dominating belief and scientific understanding for that period. But the lack of a big picture perspective behind these interpretations masks the genetic adaptive mechanism of a biological response underlying anorexia. These misinterpretations continue still today, blame the anorexics for their illness and debilitate sufferers rather than empowering them from a recovery that would enable them to thrive again. Still today, anorexics' thoughts and attitudes get conformed into whatever psychological issue the person has. This is likely the reason why psychological issues are still thought to be the cause of anorexia, although this hypothesis has been extensively tested and disproven. Paradigm shift begins by acknowledging that psychological issues do not cause anorexia. Anorexics are people who are simply born with genetic predisposition to the adaptive to flee famine response.
What we do know is that people with anorexia nervosa are born with a particular neurotransmitter profile. The neurotransmitters are the brain chemicals. People with anorexia nervosa, they're 11 times more likely to have that particular neurotransmitter profile. So there's a powerful genetic influence. Dieting and the hormonal changes of puberty are a powerful combination for switching on.
That's exactly how I've always described it. It's like I flicked a switch.
Exactly.
Wow. Wow. I think for a long time my parents asked themselves, what did we do? What did we do that led her to this? Because I had such a brilliantly normal, loving, happy childhood.
Yeah. Parents of people with anorexia often blame themselves, and it's dreadful.
You must love me.
Anorexia is what the body of an anorexic undergoes when migratory mode lasts longer than originally intended. In modern days, it doesn't matter what causes a person with a genetic predisposition to lose weight. Once the migratory mode, or adapted to flee famine response, is switched on and lasts longer than intended for our ancestors to survive real famine, the well-orchestrated biological process of anorexia begins. It can only be switched off by gaining weight.
Fighting your genes is never going to pay off when it comes to energy regulation.
Well, this may just be a genetic evolved response, and though it feels scary to eat, I'm going to have to do it because I need to put on weight to get out of it.